Hey everybody, I'm Brandon Adams. Welcome into a very special DawgNation video presentation, kind of a combination of a couple of things we do typically around here. A lot of you have been wondering, would be doing some sort of cover four live, given it's a Thursday, rolling into a game on Friday between Georgia and Michigan. The answer to that is yes, at least somewhat. We got three of the DawgNation team here on hand, in addition to myself. We've got Mike Griffith and Connor Riley. We're also doing this afternoon, this evening, in concert with our friends at Classic City Lager. You've heard me do the classic moment all season long from Classic City Lager. And this won't be so much a classic moment, although maybe it's being a classic show, a little bit more of kind of the moments that matter for Georgia as you roll into the game against Michigan coming up on Friday. So looking forward to hearing a breakdown from both Mike and Connor on all of this. And, this definitely, Connor, starts to feel like that. And every big game, Super Bowl, college football playoff, they all have that moment in which it's just sort of all been said. And I'm still very eager to have the conversation, but I don't quite know that I'll be able to say anything in this particular discussion that I haven't said in some of the previous discussions there either. At a certain point, it's been chopped up every which way that it can. I guess the only thing that maybe makes my opinion different than some of the ones that I've heard is I do probably like Georgia a little bit more than some of what I've heard from some other folks from time to time. But other than that, I think a lot of us see a game playing out in a somewhat similar fashion. And what's kind of on your mind as you've watched all this play out here this week?
You know, I think this is a game Georgia should win somewhat comfortably. I think the world of Michigan. I thought this was a team, even before the hiccup against Michigan State. I thought this was one of the better teams in college football, and I still think they are. But I just look at this matchup, and unless Michigan's going to drastically change what they've done, their strengths play right into what Georgia does well. I don't think this team's going to be able to run the ball with great success on Friday night. And I don't think Cade McNamara or J.J. McCarthy, for that matter, are good enough quarterbacks, nor does Michigan have the threats on the outside to really take advantage of it. Michigan's defense is good, but we also saw them give up big plays to Michigan State in bunches. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I know Mel Tucker has talked to members of this Georgia team, given how close some of them are. I believe they've looked over that tape. And Ohio State, what I point out as well, they still had success moving the ball that day. They just got a little off script because they fell behind early. If Georgia's able to stay ahead of the change and on schedule, which they were for that first half there against Alabama, they're not. I just don't really see a lot of paths to victory here where Michigan just so thoroughly outplays Georgia. Georgia could certainly come out and play poorly. We could see them. We've seen them do that in stretches this year. But I think this is a game Georgia should win in the way that it wants to win, specifically, rather comfortably.
Mike, the other day, Kirk Herbstreit participated in what there have been far too many of this week, Zoom type, situations. And folks had a chance to ask him questions. He was talking about, if he was Michigan, the one thing that he wants to see them do is play action pass on first and second down. Try to get involved there, throwing the football before on third down. When you have to throw it, throw when you have a chance to throw it on maybe a first and second down situation. And that's obviously typically a recipe for success for a lot of teams. But in terms of this Georgia team, I don't expect them to be wildly flummoxed by that, either because you got linebackers who are peeking into the backfield or because you're moving up personnel to the line of scrimmage trying to stop the Michigan run. That's not what Georgia should have to do here. Georgia ought to be able to stop the run with kind of its basic defense and not having to throw extra bodies towards that. And they ought to be plenty set up well to obviously handle it if Michigan wants to play action pass off of that. I mean, clearly that could be a recipe for success for Michigan to most teams, but this Georgia defense ought to be built from the standpoint of they shouldn't have to be so worried about those Michigan running backs that suddenly they're crowding guys to the line of scrimmage, or as a linebacker, you're peeking in, to the backfield a little too much. That's just not, in my mind, what this Georgia defense should have to do on Friday.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Brennan. I mean, Georgia's third in the nation against the run. They've been really good and actually led the nation in run defense the previous 2 years. And there's so many guys up front that are going to the NFL. Listen, Georgia's A game beats Michigan's A game, hands down, not close. To Connor's point, this is a really good matchup for Georgia. Some games are good matchups and some games aren't. Alabama had the perimeter speed and the mobile quarterback to keep plays alive and hurt Georgia, where Georgia can be hurt, which is in the secondary, specifically at corner. And I don't see Michigan strong in those areas. And this is a game of matchups. Now, conversely, the Georgia offense is going to need to find a way to be successful against a pretty good Michigan defense. I suspect we'll see a lot on the perimeter. We'll see Stetson Bennett throw the ball a lot to Brock Bowers. The tipping point to me was seeing Chris Smith out at practice, looking like he's going to be able to go. And conversely, Michigan's second leading tackler and safety Dax Hill may not be at the game. It was very iffy when Jim Harbaugh addressed the media about that. So I'm kind of in line with Connor. I mean, this is a game that Georgia should win by double digits. Doesn't mean that they necessarily will. A lot of this is how well Georgia plays. I mean, Georgia, I think, does need to play well to win, but it's been a minute since Georgia's lost 2 games in a row.
Yeah, I don't disagree with much of what Mike says there. And, Mike, I should say Mike also brings up the notion of the need to score points, need to move the football. And a lot of that is going to be on the shoulders of Stetson Bennett. We'll talk more about the quarterbacks, I'm certain, before we're done here. But, as a fan of UGA, and I'm cheering for this team to win on Friday, I want to see a little more from the Georgia running game, whether it was by choice or by force. We didn't get, maybe as much of that as I would have liked against Alabama. So I'd like to see more from that Georgia running game on Friday. There are going to be moments which the Michigan defense knows that a running play is coming. Georgia's going to be able to run the ball there in that moment, but also as a way of creating the kind of explosive plays. Ultimately, you don't get extra points if the explosive play comes in the throw game as opposed to the run game. It's just a way of making the offense more prolific, to move the chains and set yourself up for scoring opportunities, using the running game to be able to do that. To me, that's the one area in 2021 that, when you obviously compare to 2017, seems wildly different. Is this team's just not at that level when it comes to running the football. That's not going to magically change over the course of a couple of days down here in South Florida, but getting a little more from the running game than what Georgia got against Alabama, either because you call more plays or just more effective at the plays that you call. I do think that's a big part of this.
Yeah, and I point out Michigan, while they are a capable run defense, they're not at the level that Alabama is against the run. That's actually a strength of that Alabama defense there. And so I think this is a game for 2 South Florida guys in particular, James Cook and Kenny McIntosh. If Georgia, they're going to have to get creative with them, I think, just given the way this offensive line is built, to find a way to get them in space to rip off those big run plays. But we've seen at times this year, maybe not consistently enough, but if the opposing team is going to give you rushing lanes, Georgia's more than willing to take it. They did it against Arkansas. They did it for a time against Kentucky there. And so Michigan, Aiden Hutchinson came out on, I think it was Wednesday, and said, first and foremost, we have to stop the run. And if you're going to clog the box with 7 guys, I think that's what you have to do if you're Michigan, because Georgia, sort of like triple option offenses in the way that the fullback is used there, you have to take away the fullback, because otherwise they're just going to hit you with 4 or 5 yard carries every time. And that's a losing recipe. And so if Michigan is just going to say, hey, we're going to play our base defense, and we're going to let Georgia try and run the ball, Georgia's good enough, I think, to find success there for it. So I think Michigan's going to try and load up. And much like Alabama did, dare at least Stetson Bennett to start, maybe if he can't, JT Daniels to beat them through the air.
And Mike, I'm going to date myself with a reference here a little bit, but I remember back in the old days of the 80s when I was a kid, the old thought was, hey, if you're playing Reggie White, you just line up and run, you run right at him. Don't let him chase down a play. Don't let him do things like that. In the case of Ajabu and Aiden Hutchins here, let's find out. Obviously, we know they like the idea of getting around a tackle and coming on the pass rush, but how well do they like the idea of having one of those offensive linemen line up across from them and try to bash into them over the course of 60 minutes of football? How well do they hold up when they face that kind of beating? Now, they're both good players. I'm not discrediting them as players, but let's make them do something. If I'm Georgia, what my thought is, let's make them do something that maybe they're not quite as comfortable doing. We know they want to rush the passer, but how well do they want to hold up and be stout against the run? Let's find that out if you're Georgia on Friday. That seems like a pretty good recipe for me.
Yeah, and that's where Georgia's multi-tight end sets can really help the Bulldogs. And it was what makes them such a difficult matchup, because if you try to go too light with the guys that you're putting in coverage on on Brock Bowers, he's still 235 pounds and can block you. And certainly Darnell Washington is a force, 275. Who knows? Maybe he'll end up an offensive tackle before it's all said and done if no one's throwing him the football. I have a feeling he will get the football, by the way. John Fitzpatrick, another big guy at 255. I mean, so you're not just single blocking Ojabo and Hutchinson. You're double teaming him with tight ends involved. Maybe a back comes out of the backfield. If it's a McIntosh or a Milton or Zamir can deliver a blow, help at the offensive tackle, to your point. A pulling guard, Justin Schaefer, Warren Erickson pulling, maybe Xavier Truss. You go big. and use a pulling guard. So to your point, I do think Georgia's going to try to establish the run. I think they're going to pound it. I think they're going to try to get that play action game going with Stetson Bennett. We know he's not comfortable just in the drop back game. He never really has been. But if Georgia's able to run the ball effectively, which I think they could be able to do that, I think that's what opens up the play action. And that's when Georgia can make some explosive plays that'll tilt this game.
Connor, I have a little bit of a theory that I operate on, which is that if you think a player's hurt, he probably is. If you have a reason to believe a player may have something going on, chances are he probably does.
Yes.
So there's been all the mystery around Dax Hill this week, the Michigan safety, Michigan players of the day, not even wanting to address whether it was even in Florida or not, forwarding all those questions along to Jim Harbaugh. Harbaugh today also sidestepping some of that a little bit. I get the impression that he's either not in Florida, not in the state right now, or he's going to get here, try to play, but not really be 100% effective because he's been away from the team for such a long time. So let's just assume for the moment that you kind of take Hill off the table for this Michigan defense. How big of an advantage do you think that creates for Georgia taking a big name player out of the mix for the Maize and Blue?
Yeah, when we talked to Jim this morning, he said as of that point in time that Hill was not in Florida at this point.
But he did acknowledge that today?
Yeah, he did acknowledge that.
Maybe I misinterpreted that quote then.
So clearly he hasn't been practicing with the team this week since Michigan got down there on the 25th. And they weren't going to single cover. Like Daxton Hill was not going to be that guy that covered Brock Bowers in every play. They're going to have a plan. They've had a plan obviously in place, but Daxton Hill is one of the rare athletes, I think, especially in that secondary, which is the weakness of this Michigan defense, that could at least athletically try and keep up with Brock Bowers. And so you take away one of the more athletic defenders, especially a guy who could cover the middle of the field for you in the way that Hill does. It makes covering him all the more difficult and forces you to allocate other resources to covering him, which in turn should open up things for guys like Adonai Mitchell, Ladd McConkey, Jermaine Burton, George Pickens. I think one of the more interesting things that I'm looking to see in this game is what is Pickens' involvement? What is his snap count? The number that I've sort of internally had is around 25 snaps. Can you get him to that number? He played 12 against Alabama, missed a little bit of practice time when he was in COVID protocol, but he's down there in Florida now with the Georgia team. With the extra month off, giving him more time to recover from the knee, get more integrated in the offense. If George Pickens is out there for 25 snaps, you realistically think you could get him about 6 targets. If you're able to hit on 3 of those, and 3 of those are sort of the 15-yard plus explosive passing plays, that's going to make a big difference for this Georgia team. So, the Daxton Hill issue, I just find it hard for him to be much of a factor in this game, given he hasn't been with the team and practicing this week. And, let's not overlook the fact, you guys are down there now. It's an adjustment when it's 80 plus degrees and humid, where he's coming from Michigan where there's snow on the ground. Yeah. So that's a tough physical turnaround to have in that short of time span. You even hear some of the Georgia guys talk about the difference from the Georgia weather and the South Florida weather. So I don't expect Dax Hill to be much of an impact in this game, if at all. And I think that should make things not just easier for Brock Bowers, but for everyone else on this Georgia offense.
Mike, Connor mentioned George Pickens, and obviously Georgia fans want to see more of him in this game. Certainly you can include me on that as well. However, I have to admit that I wonder if the fact that, Pickens is also much the same way that Hill's dealt with some COVID stuff. For a while, Pickens wasn't with the team. He didn't travel down with the team when they first arrived here early in this week. Doesn't that complicate the idea of getting Pickens more involved if he's been away from the team some, just trying to be as realistic as you can possibly be here?
Yeah, I think so. And Kirby alluded to that, Brandon. He mentioned, and so did Todd Monken the other day, that Pickens is still in development. This is a guy that didn't have spring, yada, yada, yada. And now that you have Stetson back there again, it's not the drop back pre-snap, read the whole field offense like it was with JT. It's a much more simplified play action, reduce the number of reads, get rid of the ball quicker. And I just don't think that George, the numbers bear it out, that he has not been as much of a factor with Stetson Bennett under center. It just hasn't worked out that way. Stetson doesn't throw the deep out, seems a little bit more reluctant to throw the deep shoulder fade, and as much looks for, more of the high percentage throws that get set up through play action. So I don't really know the extent of Pickens' involvement. I know from talking with his family over the holiday break that George has worked incredibly hard to get back in 8.5 months. Of course, they were disappointed that he wasn't able to get more involved against Alabama. It's hard to be from the state of Alabama and see Alabama guys catching the ball for 200 yards. And, you can't get more than 5 throws in your direction at Georgia. That wasn't what they were told during recruiting. So, I'd like to see George get more involved just because of how hard he's worked to get back, know how competitive George is, wants to be a part of the solution. So I think Connor's number is probably close, 25, 30 snaps and, maybe 7 or 8 targets. But if we're being honest, Stetson and George have never really developed a chemistry. So it's hard to imagine more than 5 or 6 catches. And yet still, I think George could be a factor if he makes those catches at the right time, right place.
I mean, 5 or 6 catches technically would be a very big game and the kind of thing that have a chance to really certainly improve Georgia's chances of winning, especially for a guy like Pickens, who has a little bit of a penchant for the catches that he makes being pretty dynamic catches. I mean, if you told me right now I could get 5 or 6 catches from George Pickens, I don't care who's playing quarterback. I'd take that and run with it.
Yeah, you're right. And especially when you look at how low the volume is, if Kirby could get away with 55 runs and 11 passes like he did against Arkansas, he'd do it. This is not a high volume offense, a high volume pass offense at all. They do want to run the ball, smash mouth, a lot like Michigan, right? Both of these teams want to smash it and set up the play action deep throws or the play action game breaking throws. So you're right. If George were to get in this specific offense that they're running with Stetson, if he were to get 5 catches, that would be a really good day. Although, Brock had 10 for 139 and 16 targets against Alabama.
So, Connor, along those same lines, and I guess we've kind of held off on getting to the quarterback thing as long as we possibly can here, but much the same way I say to Mike, realistically, I just wonder, if this is going to be the big breakout performance from Pickens, given the fact that he's been away from the team here a little bit. By the way, I should also point out that we're pre-recording this, so I'm assuming, based on the reaction from Connor Riley, that Shane Beamer has gotten his mayonnaise bath there for the game there in Charlotte, North Carolina. So kind of react to the mayonnaise bath here for Beamer, and then we'll get to the quarterback thing after that.
It's everything I wanted it to be. Just beautiful mess. What a wonderful sport this is, college football, and a wonderful time of year with the bowl game. Making the hard transition. He got hit on the head by the cooler, by the way. I like Nick Saban.
Well, let me just jump in here and say this. Before we're done, I actually want to talk to both of y'all about some of what we've seen from college football over the course of the last few days, the silly and the maybe not quite so silly. It's been a very interesting bowl season. There's been a lot of talk about this online. I am curious of what y'all both think about that. So we'll do that before we're done. Before that, though, as you transition to quarterback, give me a very long answer if you don't mind. I don't typically say that, but I need to go plug in my laptop while you talk. So, Mike, you play the role of the listener here. Connor, you speak, and then I'll be back in just a second.
BA just trying to keep the quarterback stuff as far away from him as possible. Yeah, I mean, Kirby Smart and Todd Monken have both come out and been forceful that Stetson Bennett is going to start this week. And I think it's important to note that because from what we've seen with Stetson, if you look at his best games this year, I would say on the road at Auburn, at Kentucky, or home for Kentucky, excuse me, and then you factor in that UAB game as well. JT Daniels wasn't available in those games. Stetson knew Stetson was the guy at quarterback for that game. And I, as someone who struggles with confidence himself, you can certainly understand why it's important to have confidence in your guy and outwardly state that the way that Monken and Coach Smart have this week. So I do think that matters as an important to Stetson. And this team believes in Stetson Bennett. Stetson Bennett got them to, the 12-0 mark. He played a big part in that. And so with that in mind, having said all that, look, Stetson's got to play well. He's got to play better. 5 trips to the red zone against Alabama, 4 of them in the first 3 quarters, 10 points in those first 4 trips. That's not good enough. And against a stout Michigan defense, you're going to need to execute in the red zone when you get down there. Stetson just needs to be better in that. You can factor in third down as well, where Georgia was, I believe, 3 of 12 against Alabama in that aspect. And then obviously, and Monken said this as well, you can't throw interceptions. And more specifically, you can't throw pick sixes, because if you look at the numbers in terms of when defensive touchdowns happen, the odds of you winning that game shrink dramatically. So Stetson's got to find a way to not turn the ball over. He's done that, for the most part this year, but against the more talented teams, at least in terms of raw composite, Florida and Alabama, he has thrown 4 interceptions in those games this season. So, as far as JT Daniels and his involvement for this game, I do think there'll be a shorter release. How short? It really depends. Yeah, I think the COVID sort of impact that it had on JT, him missing 3 practices, plays somewhat of a factor in that. But look, if Stetson struggles and isn't playing well, I think the Georgia coaching staff at that point would say, hey, Stetson, we appreciate you for getting us here, but you've taken us as far as we can. I think we need to see what we have in JT right now, even though with all the missed practice time that JT has over the season, making him somewhat of an unknown. I think at a certain point, Stetson shows you who he is. And if he shows you that he's turnover prone once again in a big spot, it's hard to keep going back to him at that point.
I mean, Mike, I don't mind telling you as a fan that if Georgia were losing this game on Friday, I would hope that they would consider making a change there at that spot. But I also have to admit, as someone who kind of talks this stuff for a living, just given the fact that it hasn't happened before now, and this moment kind of coincides the time in which Daniels also, I guess, has been away from the team for a while, I'm just really skeptical that would occur. I'm not really quite so sure what the picture I have in my mind is of what would need to happen for JT Daniels to be back on the field and playing again. But there's a part of me that just assumes it's not going to happen, even though people like Connor have kind of used this phrase along the lines of a shorter leash for Bennett, more opportunity for Daniels. Maybe that's true, but I just find myself just being a little skeptical of all of that.
It's really hard to know. It's like Todd Monken said, who knows what's behind the next decision. It's a gut feel for the head coach when he makes that call, when he's willing to have the discussion on the headset, so to speak. As Kirby told us, they didn't even discuss putting JT in the last game, and they were down 21 points. That would certainly seem like the time you would turn to a gunslinging quarterback, that had scored a lot of points. I guess his last start, he had 35 points in the first quarter before he re-aggravated his oblique, and Stetson went in and scored 3 points in the second quarter. So to Connor's point, I think if we psychoanalyze this, I do think that Stetson is more fragile emotionally than JT. I think we've seen that. Connor brought up how well Stetson played when he knew he was the only guy. I think it's important to note the other day when Coach Monken was doubling down and making, Stetson Bennett, sound like a reincarnation of Fran Tarkington with championship plays. And we were all kind of lost for what those national championship plays were. I think it's important to note Stetson was in the room listening. Stetson heard those questions. Stetson heard those people doubting him when it was his turn to speak. I've had people tell me they felt like Stetson came across as defensive. I'm not sure what he's normally like, so I can't say. I do know this. I do know that it was noted by NFL people that have talked to me about some of Stetson's body language in the last game when things didn't go well with receivers. The palms up stuff that wasn't a good look. That's not a healthy thing. I'm sure that Kirby has coached Stetson on that. I'm sure they've talked to him about that. But I don't know that it gets to that point. I guess I'm just seeing the glass so half full that I don't see a situation of adversity. I think this is a game Georgia gets an early lead in, pulls away, and I don't even think we're having a conversation about there needing to be a quarterback change. And it could go the same way in the national championship game too. If we recall, Georgia was beating Alabama 10-0 through the first quarter. And, it's like the fans say, if the defense does their job and holds everybody under 14 or 17, then none of this happens. So just need the defense to show up and pitch a shutout for a few quarters or hold Michigan to 10 points and don't even need to worry about quarterbacks.
Well, that's why I think for some Georgia fans, they feel like another pocket of their fellow fans have made too much of the quarterback conversation, because this is a Georgia team that's, even with whatever certain people view happening at quarterback, is still favored to beat Michigan. That's a 12-1 Big Ten championship team. You'd have a chance to be back in the national championship game. And Vegas, by the way, still favors Georgia to win the rematch against Alabama through everything that's gone on here. So I think that's one of the reasons why some Georgia fans are frustrated with other Georgia fans, because they feel like they fixated on a quarterback issue that may or may not be what holds Georgia back from winning the national championship. But one thing that I would say in response to that, whether Bennett plays, whether Daniels plays, the one thing that I feel like we can all agree on is Georgia just needs better play from the quarterback position all the way around. That Georgia could win this game on Friday, regardless of what happens at quarterback, but obviously it'd be easier to win the game if Stetson goes out there and has a really big game. I think there's a really good chance that he might actually just go out there and do that and might, really, stuff in the face of, some fans who maybe have lost belief in him or something like that. Maybe he goes out and does that. But one way or another, when you look at what happened in the game against Alabama, whether you're a pro stat guy or a pro JT guy or whatever else, I mean, everybody can acknowledge that just statistically speaking, Connor, Georgia needs better play from the quarterback position than what it got the last time we saw this team play.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether that's Stetson or JT, JT was not all that good, in my opinion, against Clemson earlier this season with its similar type defense to Michigan. And so whoever the quarterback is, the bottom line, people think JT Daniels could be that guy. They need better quarterback play in these big spots, whether that be Jake Fromm, Aaron Murray for the most part. I mean, it's been an issue against Alabama for years. And again, having said all that, you still need this defense to come out and play well. I don't think this defense should be given a pass in these big moments. You look at, say, this was a topic of discussion on Twitter this morning, all this talk about wanting to have a generational quarterback, a difference maker at the quarterback position. Let's look at the last couple of national championship games. Alabama had Tua Tagovailoa in 2018. Clemson had Trevor Lawrence in 2019. Ohio State had Justin Fields in 2020, last year's national title game. All three of those guys were first-round draft picks, Heisman finalist-type players. None of those three guys scored more than 25 points in the national title game. So you need, as much as we sit here and talk about improved quarterback play, and I would agree with all that both Mike and you have said on that aspect, you still need your defense to show up. You need to play complementary football. You hear coaches talk about that so much. It sounds a little bit like a cliche, but at this point, you need this Georgia defense to be the great unit that it was that got you to this point in the season. That's why Georgia is here. It's not here because Stetson Bennett was some elite quarterback. Stetson is who Stetson is at this point in time. You need your defense to show up in addition to Stetson elevating his game in the biggest moments, and JT for that matter as well.
And Mike, along those lines, I think this has been the best defense in the country this year. And I think Kirby Smart's obviously been a defensive mastermind his time at UGA. But with the exception of the Clemson game to begin the season, this is a defense that at times has had a little bit of an issue in kind of some of these big game scenarios. Clearly, everybody's got the Alabama game from December, the beginning of the month, on their mind. But go back to last year's Alabama game. Go back to the Florida game from a year ago. Go back to the LSU game in 2019, the SEC championship. 35 points allowed in 2018 to Alabama in that year's SEC championship, which was far different than the numbers that Georgia had been producing defensively prior to that. There are some moments here against good offenses in big games where that Georgia defense hasn't asserted itself as much as you would like for it to. The Clemson game's the outlier there. They clearly did that, but other big games, I just think that, Georgia's kind of due for a big performance defensively in a big game, because I think you can point to a couple of instances recently where maybe that was not the case.
Yeah, Alabama and certainly Florida last year are great examples of that. I think you got to go back to 2018 to really find the last time Georgia was kind of manhandled physically by teams. And I think of the Texas game in the Sugar Bowl. I think of the LSU game in Baton Rouge. But Georgia's defensive front, this particular group has not been pushed around. And that's where we kind of circle back to the start of the show when we talk about the matchup. And that's kind of what Michigan does. They bully people. They pushed Ohio State around. And I just don't think they can push Georgia around. And I just don't think that they can exploit those corners. I know they have good receivers, but it's just not their bread and butter. Unless they were to take an unconventional approach, which who knows, maybe they've got Keely Ringo's number circled and they're going to go at him. They've seen that weakness, or maybe they're going to go at the star position, whether it's Latavius Brini, who pretty much had his job pulled from him, or William Poole, who Kirby Smart woke up one day and said, I trust William Poole. We hadn't seen the guy play in 5 years, and suddenly he's thrust into the spotlight and expected to help stop Alabama. So I don't know what answers or what tricks Kirby and Muschamp and Coach Adai, Dan Lanning, I don't know what tricks they may have up their sleeve in the secondary. I just don't think that Michigan has the passing volume to exploit like Alabama did. And then conversely, I will say this, when I think about the loss to Florida last year, it reminds me a little bit of the loss to Alabama this year, because there was a horrible second quarter that involved 3 and outs. And that's really where Stetson failed, but it's also where the run game failed. Georgia did not stay ahead of the chains. I think Connor alluded to the fact that Alabama has a better run defense than Michigan. I think that's true. I'm not convinced that Michigan can neutralize the run game to the extent that Alabama did. And I think those 3 and outs had a lot to do with Alabama's ability to put those 24 points up in the second quarter. And I just don't think Michigan's going to get that number of possessions that they would need to exploit and wear down the Georgia defense like Alabama did.
So I want to do a quick final thing, kind of away from this game for a moment. This has been a very hot topic the last day or so. And I guess it got started by Danny Cannell, which makes some people kind of roll their eyes about a little bit. But Cannell kind of went out there with the idea of everything that's played out over the course of the last few days just shows you there have been too many bowl games. And like the whole world has kind of come down on Danny for this. And admittedly, I kind of see both sides of this a little bit. On the one hand, the bowl games I've had a chance to watch this year, even though you've had opt-outs and interim coaches and Omicron or whatever else, I've actually found the bowl action I've watched this year to be pretty entertaining, to be honest with you. But it's also seems like the sport this time of year is getting increasingly silly. You know, teams canceling the day of the game, teams canceling after, in the case of Memphis, had flown darn near 11 hours to get to Hawaii to have all that canceled. By the way, they had to pay for that. That's not free. They got to pay for that travel. Ended up being for nothing. You've got the mayonnaise bath, the snack, crunchy snack treat bath. You've got all kinds of baths being given to these coaches that win. I don't know, Connor, what do you think about the current state of bowl season right now?
More bowls, better. First of all, look, there are only 12 games in a regular season, and we all love college football. I think people complaining at the idea of more football, I just think that's kind of lame. And, these guys only have so many opportunities to go out there and play games. I'm all for it. And, what makes no one is watching, in my opinion, no one is watching college football because it is a great football product. If you want to do that, go watch the NFL on Sundays, except it's on Saturdays now at this time of the year anyway.
Sure.
When it comes to college football, we're here because of the tradition, which is the Rose Bowl. And it does kind of bum me out. And this speaks more, I think, to the larger problem with college football and how it's currently incentivized. If you don't have Ohio State, who hasn't played in the Rose Bowl in, I think, 3-4 years, none of the current guys on the team have played in that game, that don't see the value in playing in that game, you've got something fundamentally, in my opinion, wrong with your sport. And so I'm all for incentivizing these guys to go out there and play in these games. And obviously the NFL and their futures play an aspect at it as well. And I do believe it's their right to choose to opt out of it. But South Carolina fans are probably thrilled that they got to see their team beat North Carolina today to cap what was a really strong season for them. Michigan fans, even though I think they're going to lose on Friday night, I'm probably thrilled that their team's playing in a very marquee college football playoff game. Tennessee fans who are playing Purdue right now in the Music City Bowl, they're probably thrilled after the year that they've had to be in this sort of position and situation. So the whole bowl situation fiasco, look, COVID's put it in a really tough spot. I understand why people are upset when it's canceled at the last minutes. I also understand, that a lot of this, unfortunately, can be out of their control with the protocols that the NCAA has set up. And so with that in mind, hopefully this is sort of the last year that we had these sort of COVID issues when it comes to bowl games and getting these games played. But I do think it sort of exposed some of the larger issues that exist within college football at this point in time with the way this end of the season is incentivized, because the college football regular season is great. But I think even with the 14 playoff setup we have now, the end of the season results are just so disappointing because we're not enjoying what was the ride of the 2021 season, while sort of focusing on what this ending means.
Mike, I'll give you a final thought on this thing. What Connor says there is, certainly brings up a lot of very interesting points. I generally agree with him that I like the bowl season. I wish I certainly don't want there to be fewer bowls than there are right now. And Connor brings up some interesting ideas about how maybe more participation could be incentivized. And you can respond to that if you want to, but I'm also kind of curious, and I talked about this a little bit on DawgNation Daily today, the contrast between Nick Saban, who said on his radio show on Wednesday that, his players voted to basically stay in the hotel the entire time. I think a lot of Georgia players, when it comes to free time, have chosen to do the same thing. I know John Fitzpatrick talked about that, but Georgia's also participating in the team events, the dinners and things. I honestly don't know if Alabama's doing that or not, but I don't see anything wrong with having a little bit of fun come bowl time. This notion that you're going to do nothing but prepare for the game 24 hours a day for 7 full days while you're here, or the 3 weeks prior to that. I think you got to have a little bit of an ebb and flow if you want to be as focused and energized as you possibly can be when you want to be, which is on Friday night. What did you make the contrast with all of that, or really anything you want to say on this topic here for the moment?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that but I'll say this too: there's not as much to do in Dallas as there is in South Florida with the beach. So I don't think Nick Saban would have taken the same approach and gone the Alcatraz approach and made his guys sit in a hotel and look out the window and see the ocean and not.
Now, what's funny though is, to cut you off just 1 second, for a guy like me, Dallas is probably a better nightlife city than Miami is. You get over to like Fort Worth, where like Billy Bob's and some of those type of places are. Like, a guy like me's probably having the time of his life on the nightlife scene in that Dallas Fort Worth area, whereas like some of the stuff around South Beach, like any place where it's popular not to wear a lot of clothes, is not really the place I'm going to thrive from a nighttime perspective, if you get my drift on that. But a place, a little bit more Dallas Fort Worth style, that's probably like the kind of nightlife city where a guy like me would probably thrive in. You get over there to some of those honky tonks over in Fort Worth, you're having a great time.
Yeah, that's what South Beach. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think South Beach has some nightlife too, but to each their own.
No, I'm saying it's just a different kind of night. I'm saying that's the kind of nightlife that a guy like me probably doesn't thrive in quite as well.
If you're looking for the mechanical bulls, then Dallas is definitely the place to be in the barbecue. Then that is definitely a place to be. But to your point, I hear what you're saying. It's what you make of it. There's things that they could have done had they wanted to go out. I think there's an amusement park there, and as you mentioned, there's some great barbecue places and fun spots to go. So I don't want to rip Dallas or say it's.
I want to know which Alabama players, like a massive like JFK conspiracy theorist, like who's like at Dealey Plaza, like grassy knoll. You got to think of a team full of 85 guys. At least one of those guys is a massive like JFK conspiracy theorist, right?
I guess I wasn't going there with this breakdown, but no,
I didn't plan on going there myself. It just sort of, that's the fun. It just sort of happened.
It just kind of happened. I think we're all a little punch drunk. It's this month is the game can't get here fast enough. But to your point, I think that the bowl structure and players opting out, I think there needs to be some sort of contract. At least I used to think when guys signed up for a scholarship, that meant they were going to play the whole season with their team. But now that's changed and they don't feel like they owe their teammates that. I do think that the current protocol is for players to play if it's a playoff game, but the new protocol we've seen is if it's not a playoff game, it's not important enough for a player to play in the bowl game. That's disappointing to me, and it takes a little bit of the fire out of the bowl season. I also think the lack of access just in general has hurt the bowl season. I mean, this used to be a time when you'd sit down and write a lot of stories about a lot of players and their journeys, their careers, how they've evolved. You tell those stories, there'd be video, there'd be, and that just doesn't happen now. It's just, I think it's turned into more like a NFL playoff weekend. We talked about shutting off we couldn't even go watch the practices. We can't even tell you who's going to dress for the game tomorrow. We're just over 24 hours out and we don't even know who's going to be in uniform for these teams. So to me, it's gotten the pendulum swung a little far to the right. I don't think that's healthy. It'd be great for us to talk to Brock Bowers here. Anyone? We still haven't talked to Darnell Washington. To me, though, this is part of the bowls, is telling the story, reflecting on the season. And I think one of the unintended consequences is this just has a very much more of a business NFL playoff-like setting. My answer to more bowls is expanded playoff. And I also like Vince Dooley's idea. I think in the spring, instead of spring scrimmages, we should have teams play each other. Home and home, split squad, Alabama, Georgia. I think they'd fill those stadiums up, or split squad, Ole Miss, Georgia. If they're not on the schedule, I mean, I suppose there's a chance you could run into that team in the SEC championship game, but I think they ought to do split squad scrimmages. I think it would be beneficial to both programs. I think it would drive revenue. No truth to the rumor that Georgia would want to move their scrimmage to Jacksonville. I would do the split squad scrimmage in Sanford Stadium in the traditional stadiums, not neutral site split squad scrimmages.
So if you get your bingo card out, I think Mike pretty much hit all the line there on that last answer there. Hey, good stuff, Mike. Good stuff, Connor. Also, great stuff from our friends at Classic City Lager. You know, your chance to, as you're getting ready for a New Year's Eve party, you're getting ready for a game watching party, whatever you're getting ready to do this holiday time of year, Classic City Lager goes great with it. So wherever you're doing your shopping, you're picking up food, whatever else you're getting this time of year, right there in the section, the cool chilled section, you can find some Classic City Lager from our friends at, what do you call those? The refrigerator? I guess the refrigerators, I guess what you call those. The point is, Creature Comforts Brewing Company's got Classic City Lager right there for you, available all year long. It's just good cold beer. It's a lager style beer, which means lighter in color, but no sacrifice in flavor. Bold, crisp flavor. It's a craft style lager, the kind of thing you would expect from our friends at Creature Comforts Brewing Company. So try some today. This has been kind of our moments that matter with Classic City Lager. We've done the classic moment all year long. So no matter what we call the show, the one that we call Classic City Lager is our choice for beer this time of year. So check out some Classic City Lager. Also, big day of DawgNation coverage tomorrow. It is game day. We'll do that then with you, Mike and Connor, throughout the day at DawgNation.com. I'll be with you on video before and after the game, live from Miami. It's been quite the privilege and pleasure to be able to narrate this experience of watching Georgia back in the college football playoff. Again, for all of you, thanks for allowing us to do it, and we will talk to you again next time.